A miner walks out of a narrow, dust-choked tunnel in the early days of the 20th century, holding something in his hand that absolutely should not exist in the American Southwest. He has spent weeks lowering himself down the sheer, unforgiving limestone cliffs of the canyon, ignoring the warnings of the local indigenous guides who refused to go any further. They had told him, in no uncertain terms, that the deep fissures in the rock were not places for the living, that they belonged to those who came before, and that going down into the dark was an invitation to something no man could fight. He ignored them because he was looking for copper, and perhaps for gold. But what he claims to have found inside that cliff face was not a vein of ore. It was a door. And behind that door was an architectural impossibility. You are looking at two completely different versions of history that are not supposed to share the same space. On one side, you have the ancient oral tradition of the Hopi people, who have lived on the high mesas of Arizona for over 1,000 years, passing down a terrifying and specific memory of a time when the sky rained fire and the earth froze, forcing humanity to seek refuge deep underground. On the other side, you have paper records, prospectors' journals, and a very specific newspaper article from the spring of 1909, claiming that white explorers had just discovered a massive, artificially carved subterranean city hidden inside the walls of the Grand Canyon. We are told by modern historians that the indigenous stories are just beautiful spiritual metaphors, and that the prospector reports were just cheap newspaper hoaxes designed to sell copies to a gullible public. But when you put these two things side by side, a very uncomfortable question begins to take shape. Was the ancient legend actually a memory of something real? And did those early miners stumble directly into the physical proof of it? We are going to look at what the Hopi actually said about the beings they called the Ant People, long before any outside historian arrived to write it down. We are going to examine the exact claims made by the prospectors who supposedly breached those sealed caves. We will look at what the federal archives do and do not contain regarding this expedition. And we will look at the ground itself, the geology and the geography of the canyon, to see if such a thing is even physically possible. To understand what might have been waiting in the dark, you first have to understand the people who have been guarding the entrance. Long before any newspaper reporter arrived in Arizona, before any official mapping expedition tried to tame the Colorado River, the people who lived upon the high, arid mesas already knew the landscape intimately. The Hopi are considered one of the oldest living cultures in North America. Their villages, like Old Oribe, have been continuously inhabited for almost a millennium, and they treat the land with a caution and a reverence that has nothing to do with primitive superstition, and everything to do with generational survival. To us, the desert is a place to visit. To people who have pulled life from that dry stone for 30 generations, the land is an archive, and that archive contains a very specific memory. The story was not written down on parchment or carved into stone tablets. It was spoken, passed carefully from grandparent to grandchild, always with the same precise details, and always with the same profound respect. According to Hopi cosmology, we are currently living in the fourth world. The previous worlds were destroyed because humanity lost its balance and fell into corruption and conflict. The first world, called Tokpela, was destroyed by fire, perhaps volcanism or a solar event. The second world, Tokpa, was destroyed by ice. But during these cataclysms, the virtuous members of humanity were not wiped out. They were saved. And they were saved by a group of beings the Hopi call the Anu Sinom, which translates to the Ant People. Listen closely to how this survival is described, because the details are going to become profoundly important very soon. The legends say that when the destruction of the world became imminent, a cloud descended, or the sky changed, and the Ant People came to the rescue. They led the ancestors of the Hopi down through the Sipapu, the portal or opening into the earth. The Ant People took them deep underground, into vast, sheltering caves. Down there, the Ant People taught the human refugees how to survive. They taught them how to store food for long periods, how to sprout seeds with minimal water, and how to build architectural spaces that could sustain a large population without seeing the sun for months or years. The legend says the Ant People were generous and industrious, often going on short rations themselves so that the human refugees would have enough to eat. To us, listening from the comfort of the modern world, it sounds like folklore. It sounds like an allegory for the changing of the seasons, or a myth designed to teach children the virtues of hard work and community storage. But to the people who lived off that harsh land every single day, it was practical history. It was a record of an ancient bottleneck in human survival, the kind of knowledge you did not ignore twice. The Hopi still honor this memory today. The most sacred space in a Hopi village is the kiva. It is a subterranean or semi-subterranean ceremonial room, entered by climbing down a ladder through a hole in the roof. The architecture of the kiva is explicitly designed to represent the underground world of the ant people, the place of salvation. Even the word for the hole in the floor of the kiva, the sipapu, represents the physical threshold between the deep underground and the surface world. For centuries, the elders maintained strict warnings regarding the deep canyons and the hidden fissures in the earth. To them, these were not places for recreation or exploration. They were the tombs of the ancestors. They were sacred sanctuaries that had been sealed for a reason. The youth were told never to go seeking the deep tunnels, because to disturb them was to disturb the balance of the world. This was the law of the land, unbroken and respected. If you enjoy stories that the history books quietly skipped, consider subscribing, because this channel lives on them. Hold on to that ancient story, and hold on to the image of the kiva and the vast underground granaries. Because in a few minutes, a completely different kind of document, written by men who had never sat in a kiva and had no interest in indigenous oral history, is going to describe almost exactly the same thing. We are going to look at what the newspaper records actually say, at the physical evidence that was supposedly pulled from the rock, at why the official version leaves so much unexplained, and at what happens when the relentless greed of a gold rush crashes headfirst into a sacred boundary. And this is where the story stops being a quiet legend whispered around a fire, because someone finally wrote it down as fact. The turn of the 20th century in the American West was a time of aggressive, almost feverish exploration. The frontier was closing. Men with pickaxes and dynamite were scouring every inch of the canyons, looking for copper, silver, and gold. They were pragmatic, hardened men, completely uninterested in preserving the spiritual balance of the earth. They were there to crack it open. On April 5, 1909, the Phoenix Gazette printed a story that should have changed the course of American archaeology forever. The headline read, "Explorations in Grand Canyon," followed by subheadings claiming that an entire underground citadel had been discovered, filled with mummies, artifacts, and architecture of an advanced nature. The article was detailed, specific, and incredibly lengthy. It was not a two-paragraph rumor. It was an extensive interview with a man named G.E. Kincaid, who claimed to be an explorer working with funding from the Smithsonian Institution under the direction of a Professor S.A. Jordan. According to the report, Kincaid was traveling alone down the Colorado River in a small wooden boat, looking for mineral deposits. About 42 miles up the river from the El Tovar Crystal Canyon, he noticed stains in the sedimentary formation on the east wall of the canyon gorge. He tied off his boat and began a treacherous climb. 500 feet up the sheer canyon wall and nearly 1,500 feet below the rim, he found an opening. It was deliberately concealed, set back on a shelf that made it invisible from the river below and inaccessible from the rim above. Kincaid claimed he entered the opening and found himself not in a natural limestone cave, but in an engineered space. He said he walked a few hundred feet into the dark before encountering a massive cross street, a central hub. From this central chamber, perfectly carved tunnels radiated outward like the spokes of a wheel. The scale of the place was staggering. Kincaid estimated that the complex could comfortably house up to 50,000 people. Here is the part that should not be possible. Kincaid was a prospector. He had no known background in Hopi ethnography. He had never heard the tale of the Anu Sinum, but the detail he gave to the newspaper reporter in Phoenix was the exact detail the grandmothers had been repeating for generations on the mesas. Kincaid described finding massive, circular rooms branching off the main corridors. When he looked inside, he found they were granaries. They were filled with ancient seeds, meticulously stored, some of which he claimed were still perfectly preserved. He described the ventilation system as a marvel of engineering, keeping the air fresh despite being hundreds of feet deep inside solid rock. And then he described the bodies. Kincaid said he found crypts containing hundreds of mummies, all of them wrapped in a strange bark fabric. He claimed the mummies were not of typical Native American stature, but were uniformly tall, some well over 6 feet, and that their skulls exhibited unusual shapes. The walls, he said, were covered in strange hieroglyphics that did not match any known indigenous writing, resembling something closer to ancient Egyptian or Oriental scripts. He also claimed to find copper weapons, which were incredibly hard, defying the known metallurgical capabilities of the ancient Southwest. The Phoenix Gazette article stated that Kincaid had sent artifacts back to Washington, and that Professor Jordan was currently organizing a massive, well-funded expedition to return to the site and excavate the entire complex. The tone of the article was triumphant. It was presented as the greatest archaeological discovery of the age, proof that an advanced, forgotten civilization had once taken refuge deep inside the canyon. Every time investigators try to look back at this moment, they are struck by the sheer volume of specific data in the text. Kincaid gave approximate coordinates. He described the stratigraphy of the rock. He described the exact layout of the tunnels, a central hub with radiating spokes. Notice the architecture he is describing. A central hub with tunnels radiating outward, leading to chambers dedicated strictly to food storage and separate chambers dedicated to the dead. If you were to map out a subterranean ant colony, that is exactly what it looks like. A central node, radiating pathways, and segregated chambers for specific survival functions. The prospector, looking for copper, had inadvertently described the exact architectural blueprint of the ant people's sanctuary. So we are left with two accounts, separated by centuries, that should have nothing in common, and yet describe the same impossible thing. The indigenous elders said their ancestors were saved by beings who brought them underground, taught them to store seeds, and lived in deep, structured caves. The white prospector said he climbed into a canyon wall and found a deep, structured cave complex filled with stored seeds and the mummified remains of a tall, strange people. One of them has to be wrong, unless neither of them is. But there was something none of them had checked yet, and when someone finally did, the whole case changed shape. Because the moment you try to verify the 1909 Phoenix Gazette article, you run into a solid, unyielding wall of denial. For over a century, independent researchers, historians, and journalists have contacted the Smithsonian Institution to ask for the files on G.E. Kincaid, Professor S.A. Jordan, and the artifacts pulled from the Grand Canyon. And for over a century, the Smithsonian has given the exact same definitive answer. They state unequivocally that they have absolutely no record of a G.E. Kincaid ever working for them. They have no record of a Professor S.A. Jordan. They have no artifacts matching that description, no mummies, no copper weapons, and no expedition files. The official explanation is simple, and for a long time, the academic world accepted it without question. They say the 1909 article was a complete fabrication, a piece of yellow journalism. In the early 20th century, newspapers frequently printed fictional adventure stories disguised as news to boost circulation. There were tales of petrified men, lost gold mines, and buried treasure. The Smithsonian's position is that the Phoenix Gazette simply made the whole thing up, using the respected name of the institution to lend credibility to a wild, tall tale. The prospector didn't exist, the cave didn't exist, and the case is closed. And if you stop reading there, it all makes perfect, comfortable sense. But the archives of history are notoriously messy, and when you look closer at the context of 1909, the neat, official explanation starts to show cracks. First, let us look at the newspaper itself. The Phoenix Gazette was not a cheap tabloid known for printing daily fictions. It was a serious, reputable regional paper. While hoaxes did happen, dedicating a massive, front-page, highly detailed spread to a complete fabrication, complete with specific geographical markers, was highly unusual for a paper of its standing. Furthermore, the article named specific people and institutions. In an era where libel and fraud were still prosecuted, dragging the Smithsonian into a fake story was a bold and legally dangerous move. Now look at the institutional context. At the turn of the century, the Smithsonian, under the influence of men like John Wesley Powell, had a very specific, linear view of Native American history. The prevailing academic doctrine was that the indigenous peoples of the Americas were relatively recent arrivals and that they had developed strictly through primitive evolutionary stages. Anything that contradicted this linear narrative was highly problematic. If an expedition actually found copper metallurgy, non-indigenous hieroglyphics, and massive underground engineering that predated known tribes, it would have shattered the established academic framework of the entire continent. Is it possible that the Smithsonian simply buried the report? Ask yourself how institutions operated in the early 1900s. Artifacts were frequently mislabeled, lost in vast storage facilities, or quietly shelved if they did not fit the curator's thesis. This is not a wild conspiracy theory. It is a documented reality of early 20th century archaeology. The absence of a record in an archive is not proof that an event never happened. It only proves that the paper is not there today. But the most compelling counterargument to the hoax theory does not come from the newspaper or the archives. It comes from the ground itself. Geologists know that the Grand Canyon is not just a solid block of carved sandstone and shale. The redwall limestone layer of the canyon is highly porous and literally riddled with massive, natural cave systems. Stanton's Cave, the Cave of the Domes, and hundreds of other fissures exist throughout the gorge. Some of these natural caves are enormous, and we know for an absolute fact that ancient peoples used them. In 1933, archaeologists officially discovered Stanton's Cave in the canyon, and inside, they found dozens of split-twig figurines hidden under rocks, left there by a mysterious culture thousands of years ago. We know ancient people were penetrating deep into the canyon walls, performing rituals and leaving artifacts in the absolute dark. The physical reality of the geography proves that deep, hidden caves exist, and that ancient humans used them exactly as the Hopi legends claimed. Then there is the matter of restricted access. Today, massive swaths of the Grand Canyon are completely off-limits to the public. There are strict no-fly zones over certain sections, and hiking into specific side canyons is legally prohibited. The official reasoning is always safety, the protection of fragile environments, or the preservation of bat habitats, all of which are valid, logical reasons. But for those who have spent decades tracking the Kincaid story, the restricted zones overlap suspiciously with the coordinates approximated in the 1909 article. Now, put it together. The ancient legend warned of it, describing subterranean survival and granaries. The 1909 report recorded it, describing underground architecture and granaries. The geology of the canyon fully supports the existence of massive caves capable of holding such structures. And the official record denies everything, claiming none of it ever happened. 3 independent lines of evidence across 3 different disciplines pointing to the exact same improbable reality, which leaves only 2 explanations. Either a newspaper reporter in 1909 happened to make up a completely fake story that miraculously and perfectly described both the geological reality of the Redwall limestone and the deeply guarded, ancient oral traditions of a tribe he knew nothing about. Or the story was never a story at all. And that leaves one final question, the one everyone had been afraid to ask. So what actually happened out there in the Red Rock? After everything we have seen, the legends, the reports, the missing files, it is finally possible to say. The truth is that the Hopi legend and the prospector's report were never in conflict. They were describing the exact same physical location from 2 different ends of history. One was recounting it as a sacred memory of survival, and the other was logging it as an explorer's conquest. What connected them was real. The most logical, evidence-based synthesis is not that the canyon is filled with extraterrestrial insect aliens, as some modern fringe theorists like to claim when they hear the term ant people. The truth is far more grounded and far more human. During a period of extreme environmental catastrophe, perhaps the end of the last ice age, or a massive period of localized volcanism, the ancestors of the Hopi were indeed facing extinction, and they were saved by a different, highly advanced indigenous group who had already mastered subterranean living. This group, the Anu Sinom, were not literal ants. They were human beings. They were a culture that built their cities downward instead of upward, using the natural limestone caves of the canyon to construct a massive, climate-controlled sanctuary. They stockpiled seeds. They mastered ventilation. They understood how to survive when the surface of the earth turned hostile. They brought the desperate refugees down into their citadels, fed them, and taught them the architecture of survival. When the surface recovered, the ancestors of the Hopi emerged to begin the Fourth World. The ant people, for reasons lost to time, either died out, retreated deeper, or assimilated. Over 1,000 years, the memory of these saviors was stylized through oral tradition. Their subterranean, radial cities led to them being remembered as the Ant People, a profound sign of respect for their industriousness and their underground world. The Hopi elders declared those canyons forbidden, not because of a myth, but because they were the actual physical tombs of the people who had saved their race. It was a quarantine of respect. Centuries later, G.E. Kincaid, driven by the gold rush, ignored the warnings and climbed into the limestone. He found the physical ruins of that exact sanctuary. He found the granaries the Hopi spoke of. He found the mummies of the Anu Sinome, a taller, different ethnic group preserved in the dry, unbreached air of the cave. He reported it to his superiors, but it was 1909. The academic establishment was not prepared to rewrite the history of human development in the Americas to include a highly advanced, subterranean, prehistoric civilization that possessed metallurgy and complex architecture. It violated everything they had staked their careers on. So the artifacts were crated up, shipped back east, and quietly disappeared into the vast, undocumented bowels of institutional storage. The records of Kincaid and Jordan were expunged, the site was abandoned, and eventually, the area was quietly absorbed into restricted federal land. We cannot prove every last detail. No one can at this distance in time without access to the sealed sections of the canyon. But of every explanation ever offered, this is the only one that leaves nothing unaccounted for. It honors the absolute truth of the indigenous oral tradition. It explains the specific architectural anomalies in the 1909 report. And it aligns perfectly with the historical reality of how inconvenient artifacts were handled at the turn of the century. After everything, the warnings, the prospector, the empty archives, it all comes down to this one truth. The people who lived upon those mesas were right all along. They were not superstitious. They were remembering. And the thing they were remembering had been sitting in front of us, buried in the stone, the whole time. But the answer is not really where this story ends, because what it tells us about ourselves is the part that lingers. We live in an age where we assume that if something is not written down in an official archive, stamped by an institution, and verified by a university, it must not be real. We look at the oral traditions of indigenous peoples and we smile condescendingly, calling them beautiful myths and colorful folklore. We assume that because we have smartphones and satellites, we are the absolute apex of human memory, and that people 1,000 years ago were simply making up stories to explain the dark. But this story proves exactly the opposite. The paper records, the supposedly infallible archives of our modern institutions, were easily altered, lost, or deliberately erased in less than a century. The newspaper report was buried. The prospector was turned into a ghost. The official record failed entirely, but the oral tradition held. For 1,000 years, passing from breath to breath, without a single written word, the Hopi maintained the exact physical description of a massive underground survival complex, complete with seed granaries and radial architecture. Their memory outlasted the very institutions that tried to deny it. Some doors, once someone warns you about them, you never walk past the same way again. Remember that dusty miner we started with, standing on the edge of the canyon in 1909, holding something he shouldn't have found? Look at him again now. He is not a pioneer discovering something new. He is a trespasser, stumbling blindly into a sacred memory that he lacked the wisdom to understand. He thought he had found a treasure to be cataloged, but the elders knew he had simply found the grave of the fourth world. So I want to ask you this, is there a story like this where you grew up? A local legend, a forbidden place, a warning passed down through families that everyone knew but no one could prove on paper? Tell me in the comments. I read them. I really do want to hear your answer to that, because the comments under these videos are half the reason I make them. We are building an archive of our own here, and if this is the kind of story you want more of, the ones the history books quietly skipped because they were too uncomfortable to explain, then subscribe. That is the only way you will catch the next one, and there are stranger ones coming. If this investigation kept you here to the end, a like genuinely helps more people find it. That is not a small thing. It is the whole reason channels like this survive the modern algorithm. Thank you for staying with me all the way through the dark. Keep asking why the quiet places are quiet, and I will see you in the next one.